Okay, I know this sounds a little strange, but I'm giving it another shot on the second half of this lecture on ancient beer, and I'm using my phone. Let's see if it works. After all the video cameras and everything didn't. Okay, so we were talking about Sekhmet, and the point where she discovers the a plot to kill her husband Ra, so she thinks, and decides to kill all of humanity. And she's turned into this feline headed goddess. And Ra says, "Uh oh, I better do something quick. What should I do? I can't let her kill all of humanity." And so he turns all this beer red, spills it all over the place, and says, "Sekhmet, don't worry. Look, you've killed everyone already. Don't worry about it. They're dead. That's their blood there." And in her rage, she drinks all the blood, which is actually beer. And she gets completely drunk, and then she transforms. She falls asleep, and then she transforms back into pleasant, sweet Hathor, and humanity is saved. So, in commemoration, the Egyptians drank this red beer in vast quantities, and they recite this hymn. This is after they wake up on the steps of their drunken stupor. When the royal children pacify you with what is desired, the officials consecrate offerings to you. When the lector exalts you in intoning a hymn, the magician reads the rituals. When the organizer praises you with his water lily blooms, then the percussionists take up the tambourine, the virgins rejoice for you with garlands, the women with the wreath crown. The drunken celebrants drum for you during the cool of the night, with the result that those who awaken bless you. This is Hathor returns to Medamud. Now consider for a moment why a society not only tolerates but promotes a festival of communal drunkenness. It's obviously, it brings people together. It's a shared ritual. They do it every year the same way. And alcohol, as we were talking last time, breaks down the barriers that they would normally have in their daily interaction. Everyone actually gets drunk. They fall asleep on the temple steps, and they're awoken by this music, and that's what's going on in the hymn. But on another level, it also appeases the gods, right? It shows you your appreciation for their beneficence and that they were saved. It's not really an entheogen per se, because you're not taking in the god, but you're doing the same thing that the god did as a way to remind everyone that life is precious and it's not to be taken for granted, right? That it's that we live at the god's will and we have to make them happy. So this is essentially communicating to them, right? It's a communal action that tells them that they appreciate what Ra did for them. Um, but it also, on another level, reminds people that you don't get drunk on other days, right? This is very ritually prescribed. It's a special day that commemorates this myth, but other days you can drink, but you shouldn't get drunk. So let's talk about how the Egyptians made their beer. It's a little different than elsewhere. There's a lot of disagreement about this and speculation about how it was actually done. Some of it comes from archaeological evidence, but some of it comes from images of breweries and how beer was made and speculating based on that. And some of it is based on models. You know, they've made these wooden models of various trades, and they would bury these with the dead because they needed to drink in the afterlife, right? So this is it seems like what they were doing is grinding the grain and then baking this kind of bread partially, so it can be kept, but it's still not totally. I guess so you wouldn't kill all the yeast in it. They crumble this stuff up and then they add it to a pot of water to ferment to begin as a starter, and then add dates. And the dates maybe are there for flavoring, maybe they're there to, the yeast on the outside of the dates might start the fermentation process. People dispute that. But it's also been suggested that they sprouted the barley and mixed it into another vat of cooked barley. So the enzymes in one batch would break down the starches and the sugar in the other, making it available for fermentation. It's a little different than modern brewing, but the reason I mention this is that it's still done this way in Sudan, which is right underneath Egypt, and actually had lots of contact with Egypt. You wouldn't expect to find pyramids in Sudan, but there are actually. And so this drink, is what's called bouza, not related to the word booze, just Bouza, may be a close hint about what the Egyptians were actually drinking when they drank their beer. It's cloudy and but very, very nutritious. So let's look at what the illustrations in the Egyptian tomb paintings look like, and what these little funerary models of breweries that may reveal about it. So in these depictions, it looks like men and women are pounding the grain, molding it into a kind of flat bread, and then breaking these up and putting them into jars. Then they get a kind of wort, I guess, and that's filtered through baskets and then left to ferment, and maybe with a starter from a previous batch of beer. And that's sort of kind of the way you make sourdough bread, is you use some of the previous batch that's got the fermenting yeast in it, and bacteria probably too, and that goes in and starts the next batch. Um, so so uh, so it looks like this African booza. Booza isn't made with barley anymore, though. It's mostly made with millet and sorghum, sometimes with wheat. But it looks like the same kind of procedure in many ways. And booza can actually get very high in alcohol, up to 6 to 8%, which is pretty strong for beer. They drink it unfiltered too, so it's kind of somewhere between a nutritious gruel, and it's slightly alcoholic and sour, and maybe calling it a bread beer is better than just beer. And it's pretty murky, and then in fact it's often drunk through a straw too, which is which is kind of interesting, like the Sumerians. So this process is described by an alchemist, and we'll come back to this guy because he may even have some of the first descriptions of distillation. That's arguable. I don't think he does, but in any case, he definitely describes this process. This is Zosimus of Panopolis at the end of the 3rd century A.D. That's my phone going off. We'll have to listen to it. So he says, take fine, clean barley, moisten it for 1 day, and draw it off, or also lay it in a windless place until morning, and wet it 6 hours. I hope that phone stops. Okay. Cast it into a smaller perforated vessel, and wet it and dry it. Next, dry it and make it into loaves, adding leaven just like bread, and cook it rather raw. And whenever the loaves rise, dissolve sweetened water and strain through a strainer or a light sieve. And in any case, there's a lot of disagreement about what's actually happening in this description, and of course in the illustrations, whether they're malting the grain, whether they're using barley, or more likely emmer. That's an ancestor of wheat that is more commonly used in bread in Egypt. Whether there's sweet dates in there to ramp up the fermentation or just the flavor, we don't really know. But the place that does reveal is kind of interesting. These are Egyptian papyri that describe a whole range of different kinds of beer. They'll say dark beer, sweet beer, iron beer. I have no idea what that means. Beer that does not sour, beer for eternity. I'm not sure what all these things mean, but the texts that mention these are medical papyri. Things like the Ebers Papyrus and the Hearst Papyrus, which is actually right over there in Berkeley. If anyone, if you really want to see it, it's there. Ebers is in New York. And these describe beer used in medicine. That's so weirdly the most not printed, but the most historical recorded information we have actually comes from medical texts, where they use beer in unguents or for stomach upsets or whatever it may be. But in any case, the Egyptians drank a whole lot of beer. Let me also talk about some other beer drinking people in the ancient world. We know about them mostly because the Greeks described them in details, and in disparaging terms usually, but unlike Egypt and Sumer, remember the Greeks were wine drinkers, and they thought of beer as being somehow barbaric. But they mention other people who do it, so I think this is kind of interesting. The first people they mention are the Hittites. The Hittites occupied the Anatolian region of Turkey. They're Indo-European, which means that their language is related to ancient Sanskrit, to the Greek language, and to all the Romance languages, Latin also. These are all Indo-European branches. So the Hittites are relatives of Europeans, right? The Hittites are described as drinking beer through straws. They probably learned that from the Assyrians, because this is land that was once Assyrian, and they came over, and they were also succeeded in this area by Phrygians, and that the Phrygians includes King Midas, who I mentioned at the very start of the whole lecture. So there may be some very interesting connection going from ancient times through the Hittites to King Midas. Okay. But there's another tribe that the Greeks mention as barbarian but beer drinkers, and these are the Scythians. Now, the Scythians are kind of interesting. You may have heard that about, oh gosh, not even a decade ago, I think, this ice princess was discovered in Siberia with light reddish hair and some absolutely wicked tattoos on her body. She's really amazing, and she's intact. After oh gosh, it's several thousand years. But in any case, she's a branch of this Scythian tribe that had some strange customs. They ate raw meat, for example. They drank the fermented milk of horses called kumis, which you still find in Western Asia. And they were beer drinkers. So they flourished in about the 4th century BC. So this is how the Greeks knew about them. Herodotus, who's really the kind of first historian of ancient Greeks, mentioned that they would sit in their tent with a small fire and they place certain herbs in on the fire, and they burn it and they inhale it for purifying purposes. This sounds a lot like what we were talking about last time. And then he says the Scythians enjoy it so much that they howl with pleasure. Now, the speculation is that this is cannabis because it actually is native to this area. There's no reason they wouldn't know about it. And there are interesting things about the culture that suggest not only the use of beer, but these hallucinogenics or drugs that we talked about last time. It seems they were definitely getting high. Okay, they also had this very distinctive pottery that's impressed with cords. In other words, they'd make a rope, and into the wet clay they'd press the cords around, and the cords are made of hemp. So we don't have actual remains of hemp that they used, but they definitely had it and used it. And what they would do is they would steep, this is also speculation, I think, but that they would steep the cannabis leaves in butter and then add that to the beer. So you get a kind of toddy, melted butter on top of beer, which is actually kind of good. But this is bong butter in their beer. And of course they are beer drinkers because you can't grow grapes where they live. It's just too cold. The other evidence for early beer comes from a place where it is not too hot to grow grapes, like the Middle East, but and Egypt, but exactly the opposite. It's too cold. So let's look at Northern Europe. Northern Europe is very interesting because it starts as a beer drinking culture, and it still is today, right? I mean by and large. And of course, most of our beer drinking culture comes directly from England and especially in the United States from Germany. The lager, the American beer we drink is fundamentally German. So barley here is the crucial ingredient. Again, the wonder grain because it grows in cold weather. It grows where wheat definitely won't grow, and it traveled along with wheat in that path from the Fertile Crescent before 8,000 BC or so. It gets to Greece, then to Eastern Europe, to Italy. By about 5,000 BC, the grains are in Northern Europe. And then they get to England even after that. By about 4,000 BC, they're in England, Scandinavia, places like that. So the earliest archaeological finds of beer, remarkably, come from the hinterland, places in Scotland where the Picts and the Scots in the middle of the 4th century BC were making beer. And this is the real edges of the world. This is the Orkney Islands, the Outer Hebrides, places like that. And now my phone is ringing again, but we're going to have to deal with it. So the chemical residues revealed that they flavored their beer with meadowsweet, and in one case they find henbane and nightshade in it. Though much of this appears to be speculative. So heather was also used, and the Greek author Pythias in 365 BC said the inhabitants of Caledonia, this is Scotland, so it's beyond what would be the Roman, but beyond anything that the classical people knew about, but he knew that they brewed a very strong drink, and of course he's talking about beer. Now the question is, was brewing an independent discovery here, or did it come with the grains themselves? And I think indirect evidence comes from the fact from linguistics. If we look at the word ale itself, and where the Celts actually originate from, I think there's a pretty convincing evidence here, because the Indo-European root word is alu. Okay, that's what it means. It goes into, and it has a meaning that's something like magic, something that's special and magical. And this gives rise to the word alutha, which means bitter, and then the ancient Germanic word ale, right, which was where we get it from in English. So these Indo-Europeans, one branch of those Indo-European groups, originates in Central Europe in a culture called Hallstatt, that area in Germany. But other groups go to northern Turkey, so Galatia, if you know that book in the Bible, those are these people, to Galicia in Spain, to Gaul, to Wales. That's all just another form of that same word. And of course, you know who I'm talking about. I'm talking about the Celts, right? These ancient Celtic people also, of course, end up ultimately in Ireland and Scotland, where they remain. So the Celts are one of these people who probably brought the grains, brought the beer making technology with them to much of Europe. I mean, I think we have the Celts to thank for all this, and of course, there's still beer makers and drinkers today. And all the classical authors talk about the ancient Gauls, that's modern day France, as drinking vast quantities of beer, getting drunk on it. And in fact, even there's an episode that's really funny. They burn Rome in 390 BC, and then they celebrate so hard that that the next day they're unable to defend themselves. They're all hungover, and then they're driven out. And the author Posidonius wrote extensively on the Celts, and had the general impression that these are people who fought a lot. They even fought amongst themselves, and they drank prodigiously. Diodorus Siculus says that they use their very long mustaches to strain the beer while drinking it, which sounds unfathomable to me, but okay. It's also said that it was customary to offer strangers food and drink, and that the gods looked favorably upon anyone who offered strangers drink, especially. But I think the most interesting part about beer drinking of the ancient Celts is the social setting. The Celts would get together, men would get together, and tell stories about their ancestry, about battles that were fought, about basically their history, and poems, and of course they would drink together. Right, this is the two are connected intimately, and they had no written language, so this is how the history gets passed down orally through generations. They would have these great feasts. They would drink beer and also mead. And I'll come to mead is basically just honey and water, and it ferments. So there's nothing you do to it. It's very simple. It makes itself. And they would sit down, drink vast quantities, and actually your manhood is gauged by the amount of food you can eat and by how much you can drink. And and they would talk about their ancestors and great things that they did. Athenaeus, and I'll come back to Athenaeus, he's sort of the great historian of the ancient world, tells us that the chieftain of the Averni in the 2nd century BC, and I'm quoting here, made a square enclosure 1.5 miles each way, within which he filled vats of expensive liquor and prepared so great a quantity of food so that for many days all who wished could enter and enjoy the feast, being served without a break by the attendants. Now let's think for a second what's happening here. Okay, a chieftain partly shows off his wealth by entertaining, right? And the bigger the scale, the more powerful you are, the more wealth you have, and the fact that you can squander it. But it's also a political statement, right? Think of how you're gaining the loyalty of the people by doing this. Feasting and drinking makes you sort of beholden to the ruler, right? He's done a great favor for you, you then owe him. And so the feast actually kind of establishes this line of dependence. It's a form of clientage and patronage, if you want to think of it that way. Is the Lord has this person under him, and by feeding him, he gets his loyalty, right? And we'll see that drinking often, it's used in ways like this for settling contracts, for making deals, for establishing lines of patronage. Who's boss and who's, if you're a boss and you feed your workers and give them drink, you're showing your appreciation for them, right? And making them loyal to you. So this has got a very specific kind of social function, establishing patterns of deference. But it also is sort of like a potlatch, right? I mean, you're spreading the wealth around, and everyone gets to feast, even though it's this guy's property, right? Um, and I think the other very interesting thing is, remember, the Celts didn't have a whole lot of material objects. There's nothing too much to buy, although they had great jewelry. That's true, and weapons. But this is really the only way to advertise your wealth is by consuming it, literally. Um, Pliny the Elder. You probably know that name because there's a great beer made here in California called Pliny the Elder. But anyway, it's he says this. He's a ancient writer. When the grain of Gaul and Spain is steeped to make beer, the foam that forms on the surface is used in the leaven, in consequence of which those races have a kind of lighter bread than others. That's kind of interesting. They're using brewer's yeast to bake, which we of course still do today. It's Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which means sweet fungus of beer. Okay, that sounds terrible, doesn't it? But that's direct literary evidence that they brewed beer. There aren't a whole lot of archaeological finds to substantiate this. And I think the reason for this is, for the most part, that the Celts were, of course, conquered by Rome. Rome took over all of Gaul, all of Spain, all of Britain, and this is why the Celts were pushed to the very periphery in Ireland and Scotland and Wales. But the Gauls themselves disappear. They're completely subsumed by Roman society. Um, but they survive on the periphery, and of course still brew beer. But the sites that do survive suggest rooms specifically devised for malting. There's no evidence for straws, but they seem to have drunk straight from the cups. There are wooden the tankards that they drank out of don't survive, but the staves that existed around them were made of iron, so those exist. And the sort of hoops that go around these like little barrel shaped mugs exist, even though the wood has disappeared. So the assumption is that they're drinking something that we would probably be familiar with, fairly clear, probably effervescent. And when Julius Caesar showed up at this place, he said they have vines, but they only use them for trellises. They don't have wine, but they drink, and this is his words, a high and mighty drink made of barley and water. And of course, he's talking about beer there. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, another writer, about 25 BC, said that the Gauls have no knowledge of grapes or even of olive oil, and those are the two things that are tropes for civilization, but instead they use a foul-smelling liquor made from barley rotted in water. It's of course not rotted, it's fermented, but still. And instead of oil, they use lard, so that seemed very strange to him. And he remarked about how the Celts stored their grain in these raised platforms in barns, and also in pits sealed with clay. So there's tons and tons of literary evidence that the Celts drank beer. Um, and although there will be exceptions, especially among the borders, what I find really fascinating is that you can really easily divide up Europe into a beer drinking Northern Europe and a wine drinking south. Now, of course, on the borders, they drink both. In southern Germany and Austria, for example, in Belgium, there's both. But it will roughly coincide with the borders of the Roman Empire and the German tribes above. It'll also later roughly coincide with Catholic Southern Europe and with Protestant Northern Europe. And I want you to think about why this is, because it of course has to do with climate. Grapes grow in one place and grain grows in another. But as we'll see, there's something deeper about the culture of wine that's very different from the culture of beer. Partly the scale of who makes it, and the fact that it can only be made, in one season. You need a lot of workers. You need a much bigger operation. Wine tends to be commercialized much earlier than beer, because beer is easier to make. And you can do it on a small scale. You can do it in a household. Wine is a little different. Okay, we'll come to this next time for the lecture for next week. Okay, it worked on my phone, so there. Let's talk.